7 years and 1 week ago, Naughty Dog unleashed a game on the world. Now, we face the sequel, The Last of Us, Part 2. My name is Doragon, and like the rest of the world, since June the 19th I've been playing The Last of Us Part 2. This is my first impressions video. There is an important distinction to make when looking at The Last of Us sequel. Most games come with a number 2, a new subtitle, something along those lines to differentiate it from its peers, from what has come before. The Last of Us goes a different route. Instead of giving it a full number, it calls it a part. And from my first impressions of this game, that is a very important distinction to make. People have said that you do not need to play the first game to understand and enjoy this second one. But when you consider this as the second part of the story, the second part of the narrative that Naughty Dog are wanting to tell with The Last of Us world, you suddenly realise that that first game becomes ever more important in playing and understanding this second game. And the emotions that you feel are only heightened if you've played the first. This game is not a sequel in the way that Naughty Dog have done before. This is no Uncharted 2, this is no Crash Bandicoot Warped. This feels more like a television series, continuing the narrative week on week. And that feeling of that ever-continuing narrative, that really informs what The Last of Us Part 2 actually is. Thus far I have about 8 hours worth of gameplay in The Last of Us. Now, that's not 8 hours worth of story advancement, that's 8 hours worth of gameplay, and I will come back to that, of course. But in those 8 hours, the things that I have really noticed is that this is a direct evolution of the world from the original game, The Last of Us. And that is a superb thing for the manner that this narrative is trying to be told. There will be those out there, I've seen reviews myself from the likes of SkillUp and a few others, that dislike this feeling. But I think it's a mindset situation. If you understand why it's done this particular way, it makes a lot more sense and feels a lot better when playing. The continuing narrative in The Last of Us Part 2 is a direct result of actions taken in the first game. What Joel and Ellie did directly affects what is happening to them now, 4 years later, in that same timeline. Therefore, this evolving world that Naughty Dog have created, the fact that resources are even scarcer than they were, that nature has taken over the cities even more, that cars are not as prevalent as they were in the first one, fuel is not as prevalent. This entire feeling that the world is changing, regressing somewhat, advancing in other ways, it is a powerful storytelling tool. And personally, I feel this lands superbly in this game. It's not like, say, Uncharted 2, where Nate has got no scars of what came before, where everything he's doing is just as spry as it was in the last game, even though he's been shot to hell since that point. This is a completely different manner of storytelling, and it feels almost like the first time we've seen this in a video game, where consequences fully affect what's happening in the next installment. Of course, I do realise that games like Mass Effect have existed in this world, and choices that you make in the first Mass Effect affect what happens in the third Mass Effect. What I'm trying to say here is, in something that is so strongly narrative driven, to link it so intrinsically with a massive game that came before. I mean, the first game was 20 plus hours of story. To link in with that, continue the continuity, evolve the world so that it feels like time has passed in the way that Naughty Dog have managed to make this feel. It is nothing short of miraculous. Now, this approach does come with its challenges. For example, you can't go bombastic and change every aspect of the game. You can't do what God of War 2018 did to the previous God of War series, if this is the feeling that you're aiming for. A lot of what you did in the first game has to remain so that it feels like the same world, it feels like it's evolving. And that's where one of the pitfalls of The Last of Us Part 2 comes in. And that is that we're now in 2020, 7 years after the first game released, and this still feels, in terms of controls, movement, and interactions, like a 2013 game. I can see why people are disappointed with that, because Naughty Dog have always been the pinnacle. They've been the best in the graphics, the best in the mechanics, the best in the engine. Like, when it comes to eking out every single factor of performance from the PlayStation hardware, Naughty Dog have always managed to do this. And to play their latest and greatest and have it feeling like a 7-year-old game has many people taken aback. For me, it doesn't change or affect my enjoyment of the game. I love the fact that the story, the world, the graphics, the character models, and the mechanics all make it feel like this world is evolving. There are new aspects. You're a younger, fitter individual in this game than you were in the last one. So there's things that Ellie can just physically do that Joel couldn't. And that's a brilliant take on narrative direction and gameplay mechanic changes as well, especially when you're trying to fit it into a world that feels so real. But for me, it all melds together. I can understand the complaints, I can understand the pitfalls that this will create for some folk. But for me, it is a superb direction to try and take everything. In terms of gameplay, I said I got about 8 hours worth of it at this point in time. Now, that's not 8 hours of story. What The Last of Us Part 2 does is open up the world a little bit more. It's still a linear game, it's still very much a Naughty Dog game, but it has more of a feeling of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy about it than, say, Uncharted 4. Every section is linear, there's only one start point, one end point, and you can't go and get completely lost in side missions. But there are different routes through the area, there are different approaches to each interaction, and it gives you a bit more choice into how to play your version of The Last of Us. Now, being an Assassin's Creed nut myself, I've tried the stealth approach most of the times, and for the most part, it's worked really well. And I think that is probably where most of my 8 hours of gameplay has currently come from. Slowly sneaking up behind people, quick shiv to the neck, and carry on. And it's been a very slow build-up to get to the point that I'm at. I'm happy with that. I love the option to play a game that particular way, to have that player autonomy to choose how I approach a situation is fantastic, and I applaud and thank Naughty Dog for allowing us to do this, unlike previous games in their series where you've been forced into play this section this way, that section that way, and so on and so forth. This slight opening up has definitely enhanced my personal player experience, and I think it would enhance anybody's because they can approach it in a way that suits their ingrained game style. So that's a huge positive for me. Narratively, The Last of Us Part 2 is a very difficult game to get through. It's not because the story is weak, far from it in fact, and it's not because of anything inherently within it. The Last of Us Part 2 is a highly emotive game, and the emotions that it tends to instill within you are rage, anger, and sorrow. And over the course of this first weekend of play, the Destiny community that I keep up with quite regularly, with it being one of my favourite games, has had a lot of allegations of sexual misconduct by men towards women. There have been a few other allegations going around, and credit to Bungie, they have taken the appropriate steps, and the community as a whole has stepped up as it should. But when you're embroiled in something like that, when a community that you are so well ingrained with is having a very angry, negative reaction to real-world situations, to then try and come into a highly emotive game that instills the same emotions within you and maybe even heightens them and pushes them to that next level, is incredibly difficult. I feel that even if I hadn't experienced this last weekend that the Destiny community has thrown at me, I still feel that this narrative would be difficult to get through with the world that we live in 2020, with the mess up after mess up that this world has put itself through since January, to basically try and cause the world of The Last of Us Part 2. And it's credit to Naughty Dog that they were actually able to complete work on this. I find it difficult putting a 2 to 3 hour session into this game because of the emotions that come with it. The staff, the animators, the project leads, the art designers, the base level artists, the coffee makers at Naughty Dog have all been embroiled in this incredibly emotive world for the last 7 years making it. And that must have been so difficult. As a roundup of my initial feelings of this game, I think it is going to be yet another masterpiece. It may even be, once again, game of the generation, just as its predecessor was. Naughty Dog have upped the ante in terms of a continuing narrative, in terms of the weight of your actions upon people and the world. They have created a vastly beautiful game, changing how you look at humans' impact on nature as well. I love this game so far. It is incredibly difficult to play, just from a narrative perspective, from the weight that this narrative puts on your own brain. It's not something that I feel probably should ever be binged. It should be played in small doses and worked through as you get to those difficult situations, those difficult points. There are cutscenes I've had to watch 2 or 3 times to fully take on board what has been happening on screen in front of me. I think that this game is going to blow me away in its second half. That's where everybody has said that it really takes off and changes the way that you look at it. But overall, I'm just happy it's here. I'm happy there's a different approach to video game narratives from such a revered studio as Naughty Dog. And I hope that when it comes to my final thoughts on this game, that I am as positive there as I am here. Thank you very much for tuning in, everybody. If you like this video, please hit that like button, tap subscribe. My name is Doragon, and until next time, folks, take care.